before I forget. Yeah, we had a great conversation last time. Um, just thinking about how, I think we all understand that, like, theoretically, medicine is sort of separate. It talks about the body as made out of organs and blood and skin and that sort of stuff. And then religion is more about like spirits and the afterlife and that sort of stuff. And so I think we all understand those are separate in some ways, but then we talked about ways in which they really do mix together in very important and I would say consequential ways as well, right? So we talked about laws and we talked about social conversations that are happening around important subjects. I remember Isa brought up um, some really excellent examples of what we talk about. Abortion, I think, was a big one, right? We talked about death in general. And so I think I was phrasing things like, is death a medical topic or is death a religious topic, right? Remember that? And it's both, right? You can approach it from both perspectives. And, when we choose one perspective versus the other, we get kind of a different impression, right? We emphasize different aspects of these really complicated phenomena. One thing I don't think we brought up, but is worth considering now, is Wendy Doniger's idea of double vision. You remember that? What is double vision? And Lauren's not here. I think she's in the chat though. Lauren, you in the chat? Yeah, Lauren's in the chat. So nobody's here to converse with me. So I gotta pick on you guys in the chat now. So please don't be shy. Keep me company here. So we had I can even pull up an image of it. The rabbit duck head. Remember the rabbit duck head? It's pretty hilarious. I've never seen this before. Oh, that's disturbing. It looks like a real rabbit head with a duck jammed on the back. I guess that's probably what it is. All right. So what is this academic versus insider perspective? Each reality is different. Yeah, those are all good. I think we call it outsider versus insider, but I like Lauren's thinking of academic. It all depends on how we live our own reality, kind of like blind men and the elephant. Yeah, blind men and the elephant. We hold on to one part and we say, this is what death is all about, versus holding on to the other part and say, no, this is what death is all about. Whereas in reality, it is both. And so this seems like a very simple idea, doesn't it? But I think this would actually solve a lot of problems in our world if people could do this a little more effectively. So, um, yeah, I'm going to have to remember this image. This is really bizarre. But coming back here, I think we could do the same thing, right? We can say there are two sides to many different phenomena, things like death and disease and health and all sorts of stuff. And by holding on to one and saying this is the only valid perspective, we are not only missing the whole picture, other parts to the picture, but we're also potentially picking a fight, right? And maybe invalidating something that we just don't understand. So anyways, that's something we talked about mostly last time. We talked about the soul, we talked about the pig. Yaya helped us fact check, do they eat the pig or do they not, right? And I think that was actually kind of, even though it feels like a silly little detail, it's important in understanding kind of the logic of these rituals. And then finally, we concluded by talking about cultural barriers, right? Language barrier versus culture barrier. And coming up with examples of a language barrier is pretty easy. I think we've all been there in some capacity. Even in New York, you can find a lot of language barriers. Cultural barriers a little trickier. This is a little new sentence I added for you. So there are cultural barriers in medicine, different ways of thinking about health and disease. What are some examples of cultural barriers that are happening in this book? And again, if you want to open the reading to remind yourself of some examples, We didn't finish talking about this last time, and we don't have to like go over every example. That's the beauty of this phase of the semester, is we don't have to really cover all of the content, right? The main point of class now is to give us a chance to talk to each other, talk about whatever we think is important. And obviously, if you guys have ideas, I'd love to hear them. And if you don't, then I can sort of dominate things too. So yeah, we've reached sort of a fun phase in the semester. So what are some examples of cultural barriers in medicine, either from the book or anything you can think of? So different ways of thinking about health and disease. What do you guys think? And so again, page 69, this idea gets introduced. At the
Couldn't one be
bottom, we get some examples. Oh yeah. Go ahead.
like holistic medicine?
Sorry, I didn't hear the beginning. I'm turning up the volume. Go ahead.
Holistic medicine versus like regular medicine.
Okay, so holistic medicine. Yeah, what is holistic medicine?
I'm not too informed on it, but isn't it like where you don't take actual medicine, like you don't take Tylenol or Advil or anything, you just kind of take um like home
Like
remedies?
pharmaceutical?
Yeah, like you don't do like pharmaceutical stuff, you do mostly just like teas and tinctures and stuff like that to make you feel better.
Well, let's think about the word holistic. As you know, I do love thinking about words. So what is holistic talking about? Medicine characterized by the treatment of the whole person, right? So if you look at the beginning, it might be a little misleading because the H gets dropped. Actually, I think I looked this up recently, not for this class, for something else. But yeah, it's whole, right? The whole person, taking into account mental and social factors rather than just the symptoms of a disease. So maybe a good way to think of what is holistic medicine is what would not be holistic medicine. What do you think is the opposite? So Yaya said regular medicine is maybe pretty good. And we were just talking about pharmaceuticals, how those often might get left out. So why is this called holistic, and why would something else not be called holistic? And again, we're thinking about the word whole here. What do other medicines do if they are not holistic?
I feel like other medicines kind of just target whatever you need to get better at or with,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like holistic might be like the whole being, whether that's mental, physical, spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some medicines are very targeted. So let's say I have I don't know, a tummy ache. I could take some medicine that might calm my tummy down, like a Pepto-Bismol or something like that. Or let's say I have an appendix that is inflamed, right? I don't know if you guys have ever had this before. I have not, but my siblings have, and it sounds horrible. But so then you go in and you pull that sucker out, right? Because there's a very targeted problem, and you have to have a very targeted response. And sometimes that works, right? If you break an arm, then you got to fix your arm, right? And there's not really a holistic approach that's necessary. You just focus on the very specific thing. There are specialists in the medical world, right? There's a lot of special vocabulary. Optometrists focus on the eye. Dentists obviously focus on the teeth. What are some other specialists in medicine? Oncologists, they only do cancer, although that can be from kind of a holistic approach. I suppose that's possible. Anesthesiologists only do very specific kinds of anesthetics, right? So there are doctors who are very honed in, very specific. And if we think about, the way that society kind of works, this is true across the board, right? So I'm a specialist in religious studies. And then within that, I'm a specialist in Buddhism. Within that, I'm a specialist on Tibetan Buddhism. Within that, I think about religion and medicine. So we can all kind of go into these very specific spaces, and it's not always bad, right? Good things can happen from that when we become specialized in things, but something gets lost too, right? What is the problem with specialization? Let's say in medicine. We could think in general, but what's the problem with specialization? Is there a problem? What's wrong with a foot doctor being good
Maybe
at?
you don't see the, sorry, so maybe you don't see the other aspects.
Yeah, like what?
Like if sometimes people who are as doctors who specialize in a certain area won't see the other aspects of another. So they won't connect, they won't kind of connect some dots, maybe. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, and it's hard to come up with specific examples, but that's sort of what I want to lead you guys to think about is like, let's say, yeah, I have a foot problem, I go to the foot doctor, the foot doctor looks at my foot problem and they say, well, I don't think this is actually a foot problem. You better go see this other doctor, right? And you get sent around to these other different specialists, whereas maybe the issue is sort of bigger, right? Maybe one organ is affecting the other organ, is affecting the other organ. And so to see a specialist in a very specific point of medicine, like Simone was saying, they might not be able to kind of connect within the larger system, right? And so there are good things that happen with specialization, but there are also problems as you sort of lose the forest for the trees, as they say. Um, so how did we get here? Yaya was talking about holistic medicine. So holistic medicine is trying to solve that problem, right? Just like we saw in this definition here, it's trying to think about an intimate connection between parts, right? So in terms of medicine, taking into account mental and social factors rather than just the symptoms of a disease. What sort of medicine are Neil and Peggy? So those are the main doctors, Neil and Peggy, and they're very good doctors from at least some perspectives. They're very thorough, very skilled, very well educated. But would you say that this book is talking about a holistic kind of medicine, particularly in that chapter, the high velocity transcortical lead therapy, this one at the hospital? Do they practice holistic medicine at the hospital here?
No, but mostly because a lot of times the holistic medicine, I mean, oh, sorry, yes, in the book. Yeah, I thought I was looking at the picture.
Well, in the book, I would argue that they don't either. Again, if we take in the social context, the emotional context of what's happening with these Hmong patients, remember we talked about. Why don't we look at that page 69? This is where we left off last time. We had the Hmong patients who were coming in, Hmong, Hmong, Hmong patients, where there was no clear problem. Let's see, what did they call it? Yeah, they talked about total body pain, just very general pain. And then on the next page, they talked about the Hmong cocktail, which was like a general combination of an anti-inflammatory, antidepressant, vitamin B12. Then we talked about there was an important social context to consider here, right? There was something had happened to these Hmong people that the doctors weren't taking into account. What was the context that they're missing? So again, I'll read it to you. It has been well known since the aftermath of the Second World War that because of enormous psychological traumas they have suffered, refugees of all nationalities have an unusually high incidence of somatization, in which emotional problems express themselves as physical problems. And it goes on. They do all these scans, they find no explanation for why these people were in such pain. So what did we decide is going on here? Didn't we call it a 4-letter acronym? You guys remember the four-letter acronym? Hello? Yes, thank you, Joseph. I was getting worried. And, obviously it's hard to remember all of these details, and I'm not forcing you to make notes, but it's important, this is like the main point of the book, right? Like these are the big questions. So somebody comes in, they're Hmong, they don't speak English, they say, hey, I hurt, my body hurts, my mind hurts, my emotions hurt. The doctors are like, dude, there's nothing wrong with you, and they send them off, right? But just like Joseph is saying, what we call that now is PTSD. And so by recognizing PTSD, this again is a more holistic approach. It's thinking not just what is this body, but more where has this body been, right? What has this person seen? What sort of history do they have? And so this would be a more holistic approach. So anyways, cultural barriers, this is just one example, and I think it's a good one. It's just, why are you sick? And I think when you really engage this question, you can find many different answers. And when you have a different explanation for why you're sick, there are many different ways of thinking about how to get better, right? And so this really is the cultural barrier that we're discussing here. So why don't we get into the sort of the meat and potatoes of today's lesson? One thing we haven't really talked about yet is this next chapter on government property. Again, for the folks following along at home, I encourage you to open up your books. We got page 78 is where this chapter starts. It's chapter 7. Chapter 7, page 78. So where to begin? We have this cultural conflict, right? Which normally isn't that big of a deal, but we're talking about the context of the Lee family. So here's the Lee family. Why do these cultural barriers matter so much for the Lee family? So again, a cultural barrier in medicine is thinking about disease differently. Why did these cultural barriers matter for the Lee family? Where again, we're kind of coming back to this conflict we've been talking about this whole time. Why does this conflict matter so much for them?
What I would say it's because like then they have an issue with like their daughter. I mean, like this conflict is like not looking for the best interest of the child.
Okay. So Jessica's saying the daughter has a special situation. The connection wasn't perfect, so I'm not sure I totally heard everything you said. But there's a question about what are the best interests for the child. So I think that's good. What is her issue? Just so we're all on the same page. What are we talking about here?
She has epilepsy.
Exactly. She has epilepsy. And from one perspective, the epilepsy perspective, right? She needs to take these anticonvulsants, right? To stop her from having seizures. From the spirit catches you and you fall down perspective, right? That's a very, kind of the other side of the cultural barrier. She is being attacked by these spirits, and she's very sensitive to the spirit world. And so under most circumstances, something like a cultural barrier is pretty innocuous, right? It's just like, okay, you do you, I'll do me. But in this case, and actually in a lot of medical cases, this becomes a problem, right? Because we're talking about the health of this young girl. And eventually, what happens is the government gets involved, right? So here's Justice Robert Jackson. So he passed away a long time ago. But again, for those who are following along at home, we can look at page 80, and there's this kind of interesting discussion about the laws, right? So in America, there's usually this what's called on page 80 the principle of autonomy that takes legal precedent. So let's talk about the vaccine, right? This is totally relevant. let's say I'm an adult. I don't want to get the vaccine, right? I think the vaccine, is bad for you. And this is the thing, right? Vaccine hesitancy. Have you guys heard about this before? Why are some people hesitant to get the vaccine?
I think it's because like they think that the people that created it do something with the vaccine. Like
Okay.
a lot of people will make controversies about it. Yeah.
So lack of trust in the creators of the vaccine. So maybe they're doing something a little shady. And the thing that people say to sort of make fun of this position is that maybe they're implanting something in you or whatever. But I think very few people actually take that seriously. It's more, well, let's see, what did the ISA? Future side effects that may be detrimental eventually to the body, maybe because it's rushed. Yeah, these are, I think, what people are more thinking about is like this is a new vaccine, and that's true. It is new. We don't know what will happen 10 years from now if you get this vaccine. Nobody knows because it's so new. And Joseph's saying maybe it's because it's rushed and it did come out very quickly. Just so we're all on the same page, it was thoroughly tested, right? All of the ones that are being produced now and are widely available now are thoroughly tested. So, we're trying to see with double vision, right? On the one hand, sort of why do people feel hesitant to take this vaccine? But it's also important to remember too that there is no reason to be hesitant about the vaccine, from my perspective at least. So yeah, I think that these are kind of covering it is basically a lack of trust, just like Jessica was saying. Can we force people to take the vaccine? Maybe I'll say, can the U.S. government force people to get the vaccine? It has not so far, right? Do you think it will in the future? Maybe. Yeah, how does that happen? Because there are certain vaccines that people are required to get, right? Jessica says yes. Most likely. Yeah, this is very interesting. Right, for school, for work. If you want to be a part of our community, if you want to fly in an airplane or go to a country, yeah, exactly. You guys all probably know this, but to participate in international travel, if you want to go basically to any country, you have to have certain number of vaccines. And in the United States, for most people going to school, you have to get certain vaccines and so forth. There are some exceptions to this, and one of them is religious exemption. And this is something we started to talk about last time, and that's where these laws kind of come in. So maybe I'll just go to the book for you guys. So yeah, this principle of autonomy almost always takes legal precedence, which means, for example, and again, I'm looking at page 80, a Jehovah's Witness, which of course is a religious group, has a right to refuse a blood transfusion, or a Christian Scientist a course of chemotherapy, even if he or she dies as a result. So that's kind of how American laws are structured, is if you have this religious exemption, then you can kind of, fudge these rules. But in the future, it will become likely that we'll basically have to get this vaccine in order to be in school in person. Maybe there'll be some like special hybrid alternative, but probably not, right? I think by the fall, we're going to basically just all need to be vaccinated. That seems to be my impression, at least. Now, it becomes more complicated with children, and that's why I have the Justice Robert Jackson here. He says, and I'm reading again, parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, and he was writing in 1943 here. But it does not follow that they are free in identical circumstances to make martyrs of their children. So what is a martyr? Why is he talking about martyrs? Someone that dies for a cause. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A lot of time is for a religious cause. And here it's actually pretty appropriate because most of these people we're talking about are religious people. And then there's an interesting footnote, right, where they talk about a Christian Science couple where the father, person is killed or died because of their belief. Yeah, again, belief and religion are an important part of that too. The father was not Christian Scientist. His mother, they broke up. His mother was Christian Scientist. Let me see. What was the kid's problem? I think he was diabetic. Yeah, and the kid died. So maybe I can lay this out for you. It's on page 80, but you have mom and dad, they have a kid, the kid's diabetic, they split up. Mom's taking care of him. She becomes Christian Scientist. She decides not to give the kid insulin. He dies. Father sues the mother. And who do you think should win in that case? Do you think the father should win that case? Yeah. And so he did win. Yeah. And you get more details here, but there's sort of an interesting little comment in the footnote. Yeah, I even put it on the slide here. This law professor, you don't have to know any of these names, but this law professor says, by refusing to intervene in this court case, the Supreme Court has reinforced a societal message that has grown depressingly common. It is perfectly okay to believe in the power of prayer so long as one does not believe in it so sincerely that one actually expects it to work. Now, he's being a little sarcastic here, right? What is he basically saying here? He's criticizing the court. This is a criticism. What is his criticism? What is Carter's criticism with this sarcastic remark? Because again, what we're butting up against here is our First Amendment right? The freedom of religion that this country is founded on. By punishing the mother who believed in Christian Science, the court was making, obviously it's a legal distinction, but it's also a religious one. Maybe I can put this a little bit differently. Why do you think the mother did not give insulin to her child? Is this child abuse? Okay, so Yaya says because she doesn't think it will work. That makes sense. I don't totally understand Jessica. She does not want to carry the burden. What burden do you mean? So of course, if the kid is diabetic, he needs insulin to survive, right? Do you mean there's like a burden of administering the insulin? Is that what you mean? Had to take care of the child. I see. So if we were thinking it's abuse, then maybe she is, yeah, she's tired of taking care of this kid. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt, right? Let's give her the benefit of the doubt and think she really does love her son. What is she thinking? So let's assume that she loves her son. Why did she not give him the medicine? it really does come back because she doesn't think it would work. So what does she want to do instead? For Christian, and maybe you guys don't know the answer to this, but for Christian Scientists, what is the best way to heal someone? It's faith. It's faith healing. Yeah, it's prayer. It's basically rather than give any sort of vaccine, any sort of medicine, and this is a relatively small group. They were once quite influential, and I think we mentioned them before, so we don't have to go into them too much. But yeah, it's to have faith. It's to think basically that God will heal this child, and that, you know, because God is all good, God will not allow disease to really exist in this world. And so this is sort of the mindset that people have. And again, Carter's critique is saying it's perfectly okay to believe in the power of prayer, because again, that's your constitutionally granted right, but as long as you don't actually believe in it so sincerely that you expect it to work, right? He's taking a little shot at the court, right? He's basically saying, we're not really giving these people room to fully express their belief. Let's assume that this woman loves her son. She wants what's best for her son. She thinks that prayer is what is best for her son. But it didn't work, right? And so as a result, she was punished. She was punished for this belief. In a way, we are limiting her belief. Now, I don't want to, push that too far, because you might begin to think, well, maybe I believe in all kinds of things, right? And so you have to kind of demonstrate that you believe this in good faith. But that's effectively what is at stake here. So let's take this conversation. So Carter defending the mother, I'm confused. Okay, thank you, Yaya, for your question. He is, right? He is. He's basically saying that according to US law, we can believe in the power of prayer as long as we also believe in the power of medicine, right? If we choose one or the other, we must choose medicine and we cannot choose prayer. And he's saying that that's kind of unjust, right? Again, I'll read it again. By refusing to intervene in this case, the Supreme Court has reinforced a societal, and I think I got on you guys' case about this. I really prefer the word social, has reinforced a social message that has grown depressingly common. It is perfectly okay to believe in the power of prayer, so long as one does not believe in it so sincerely that one actually expects it to work. So what we end up with is sort of two things happening. You have a choice. One, you can believe in, let's say science and religion, or two, if they're in conflict, you have to believe in science. The court's not really giving people another choice, especially when it comes to children. And again, Jackson is saying, if it's for yourself, believe in whatever you want. I don't really care if you're an adult. But when it comes to children, you have to believe in science. Otherwise, they call it child abuse. Does that make sense? Okay. So, and of course, this is important for our book, because this is what happens. So why don't I turn this over to you? We've got a half hour or so. Leah Lee is taken away from her parents. So the page I give you on the slide is page 85. Let's see, when does it first happen? Leah is government property. Yeah, so 82, she gets taken away. I think 81 is when it starts to kind of, the situation begins, and then it continues for a few pages. And I sort of summarize the main points here. She's taken away for most of a year, right? From June until April. If you think back to June last year, that was a pretty long time ago, even though I know COVID messes with our time, our sense of time. So in terms of book pages, she's basically gone for about 10 pages. So you can look at page 82 to 92, around there. So here's what I want you to discuss. was this the right thing to do, to take her away? I guess, there are a whole bunch of things you can talk about. Why was she taken away? Who was involved in making this decision? Why did they make that decision? And then other things like, what was she like when she came home, and what was it like for the family? What are the two different perspectives that are kind of in conflict here, and maybe what other possible options there were. So, but this is the main question: was this the right thing to do? Was the right thing to do to call Child Protective Services, right? CPS. So yeah, what was this the right thing to do, or were there other better options? This is my question for you. So do you have any questions for me before in the breakout rooms? Hopefully you guys had good conversations too. I checked in on 2 different rooms, and both led to some really cool stuff. I think hopefully you were able to figure out sort of the nuts and bolts of like what was happening and what happened to Leah and why the court decided to send her to Child Protective Services. If you were not able to figure that out, again, the page range is most of the 80s, right? Around, I think the whole chapter is 78 to 92. Page 81, you get the official petition from the Dr. Neal. One thing we landed on in the last group is, okay, this is ethically kind of a difficult situation. The doctors want to help the child. The parents want to help the child. I think everybody wants to help the child, but they're not seeing eye to eye. What else could have been done? Or maybe I can open this up too, because it's related to, was this the right thing to do? What do you guys think? Should CPS have taken away Leah? Does anybody want to give their hot take? Could have brought a nurse in. Yeah, exactly. And I warned you guys. I knew somebody's gonna write novel. We can talk about that another time. Yeah. So could you say more, Jessica? What would the nurse have done?
So basically, the nurse would have made sure that she would have taken the right medication.
Mm-hmm.
And taken the medication without like the mother's approval because the government implanted her to make sure of it. So they could have done that rather than take the child away, because I think like taking the child away at that age already, it's like it would cause like a bad mental state for her in a way. Like it would have also been bad for her because they're like separating her from her parents. So.
And I think this is the key. Yeah, so thank you for that, Jessica. One thing we talked about in our group is, what does CPS do, right? So again, those Child Protective Services, what are they supposed to do? Is they're supposed to prevent abuse? And I think we can all agree that's important. That's a very important service. And the question comes down to, were the Lee family parents abusing Leah? And like Jessica's saying, no, not really, not on purpose. They loved their daughter. They were taking care of their daughter. And when Leah was taken away from her parents, she was really acting very troubled. Let's just put it simply.
Professor, like I said, it doesn't have to be just abuse. It could also be malnutrition as well.
Right.
If parents aren't taking care of their children enough, they're not feeding them enough, not giving them the right nutrition, and then they're not going to be responsible enough to take care of them. So it's the same deal. I agree that they shouldn't have taken them away, but before that, they should have implemented some strategies to kind of communicate with the Lee family a little bit better, because the biggest problem was the lack of communication.
Totally. Yeah. And so Mario, I think, has been very precise in trying to argue this point.
I would agree with that too, because in the novel, I mean, it states that like they had no translators and that they didn't know English very well. So rather than get a translator to try to speak to them, they just like went about their way. So I think that's another issue. Like they never try to find a way to communicate with the parents, especially because they had 2 different languages.
Exactly. And so something as simple as, why aren't you giving your daughter the medicine? If they were easy to communicate. So for example, something I pointed the group out to on page 88, saying how these two specific medicines kind of made her drunk, basically. They had this weird side effect where she couldn't really control herself. And so the parents saw that, they thought, all right, let's not give her the full dose. Let's just give her a little bit, and maybe that'll be enough. And of course, from the doctor's perspective, it was not enough. So what's another solution is they could have given a different medicine, right? And of course, that comes through negotiation, right? There was this word compliance, which we're going to come across again, is the parents failed to comply. And so the question becomes, what room is there to negotiate with your doctor, right? As a patient, do we have any right to basically say, you know what, I don't want to take this medicine. This medicine makes me look weird, or it makes me feel weird. And in the case of the Lee family, if they were able to, they would have said, we don't want to give this medicine to our daughter. It makes her act weird. If they were able to communicate that, we would probably be in a very different situation, right? So like Mario is saying, a lot of it does come down to communication. And this is really the solution. I know they're using all these different words for medicines, but ultimately they decide to use Depakine. And this actually will become important later in the story. So on page 91, they start talking about it. And, you know, the upshot is they had initially given this really complicated kind of combination of different medicines, but in the end, they ultimately decide pediatric Depakine is a liquid that tastes pleasant of cherries and is far easier to administer than the complicated combination of bitter ground-up pills Lee had previously been taking. So the end result is, just like Jessica is arguing, and I'm sure a lot of you guys were talking about, is, and you know, and Mario too, is they just need to work together, right? Rather than like, here are the rules, you must comply. If you don't comply, we're taking your child away. You could send a nurse, you could send a social worker, right? That's who this woman, Janine Hilt, is she starts working with the family, and they come up with a plan, right? They simplified the medicine, the side effects were not as bad. And then as a result, Mr. and Mrs. Lee were commended for their cooperation and positive efforts in working with the undersigned in spite of their divergent cultural beliefs, blah, blah, blah. So that's on page 92. So hopefully you could sort of navigate all these details. I know there are a lot of them, but it basically comes down to language barrier, cultural barrier, the sense of compliance, right? The doctor comes up with instructions. The parents are supposed to comply. When they fail to comply, the child is taken away because it is a form of abuse, effectively, like Mario's saying, right? They weren't able to effectively care for their daughter. But I'm sure a lot of you were thinking, this is not right. They do want to care for their daughter, right? They have their daughter's interests in mind, which is why they were making the choices that they did. And of course, this is the difficulty, right? We have compliance versus sort of a parental form of care. And then finally, as we've been discussing, there is kind of a middle way here, but it takes communication, it takes negotiation. And so this was the problem from the start. And it took a whole year to figure this out, right? Because there was so much miscommunication going on. It took them a whole year to kind of figure this out. So we only have 1 minute left. We're going to continue to read, let's see, we technically got through the war for today, but yeah, the next chapter on the reading is called The Big One. And you can probably imagine what that means, right? What do you think the big one refers to?
She has a seizure and she doesn't really recover after it.
It's a big seizure, exactly. So so that is in the future. And so the thing that Neil was trying to prevent from happening ends up happening anyway. And so that can be kind of the next one. All this stuff is all background. And so I can maybe just go into lecture mode at the beginning of next class and catch us up to speed. So please keep reading, read about the big one. And then we will, we'll meet again on Thursday. Any questions before we call it a day? Good discussion. So this